Hello, welcome everybody. We're just giving it a couple moments while people trickle in. Welcome to the webinar. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I'll just give it a couple more minutes while people trickle in here. Okay, it's 12:01, so I think we can get started. So welcome to Fundraising for Humanities Collections, Meet Daphne Mayer. My name is Greg Stewart. I'm the Education Programs Manager at the Conservation Center for Art and Historic Artifacts, or CCHA, as we say, and I use he and they pronouns. For accessibility's sake, I will say I am a white person with some headphones on and glasses, and there's a computer and a filing cabinet behind me. Um, and so we're really excited that you could join us today. We really want to use this webinar as an opportunity to introduce you to, as the title says, Daphne Mayer, who is our new-ish Director of Business Development. She's actually been here for a few months. She's a great resource for you as you seek out funding for your preservation and collections care projects. So in this webinar, she will delve into some of the National Endowment for the Humanities, or NEH, their various grant programs. NEH advances scholarship, education, and public programming in the humanities by helping libraries, archives, museums, and historical organizations across the country steward important collections of books and manuscripts, photographs, sound recordings, and moving images. List keeps going: archaeological and ethnographic artifacts, art and material culture, and digital objects. So in particular, Daphne will highlight the upcoming Humanities Collections Reference Resource, or HCRR grants, and the Preservation Assistance grants for smaller institutions. We'll discuss who is eligible, what kinds of projects are best suited to each program, and tips on developing compelling applications. There will be time for questions and that you may have about whether these opportunities are right for your organization, although you can always reach out to Daphne directly to schedule a consultation. So before we get into it, just some Zoom housekeeping. You are in Zoom webinar, which means your video and audio are turned off, but you can ask questions or make comments to us in the chat. And we're going to be using the poll feature today. So look for that in a little bit here when we get to it. The program is auto closed captioned in English, and you can turn on subtitles with the little CC button in the Zoom toolbar. So we'll have a presentation from Daphne, followed by Q&A from you, but please feel free to ask questions at any time during the program. And when we get ready for Q&A, I'll be reading those questions verbally as they come up in the chat. So the program is being recorded, and we'll send out this recording as well as the PowerPoint in a follow-up email. And I want to not only thank the National Endowment for the Humanities for, obviously this is the subject of our webinar, but they're also helping to fund today's program so that we can keep this a free program for everybody. And as is the William Penn Foundation and the Independence Foundation, who are also making today's program possible. So next slide, please, Daphne. Oh, you're already there. Never mind. Way ahead of me. Just a quick note about the organization I work for, the CCHA. We are a regional conservation lab and preservation services facility. We're based in Philly, but we work with organizations and clients all across the country. Our conservators treat paper-based objects like books, photographs, documents, artwork on paper, and more. And our preservation services staff work in the field, providing education programs like this one and helping institutions plan for the future of their collections. The center also offers a wide range of digitization services, as well as fundraising assistance, housing and framing, and more. And you can learn more about us and what we do at our website, ccha.org. And Daphne, if you could just go to the next slide. So about Daphne, as Director of Business Development, Daphne Mayer cultivates relationships with clients and helps connect them with CCHA services and funding sources. She collaborates with staff across the organization to develop new business opportunities and grant support for programs. Daphne works closely with the CCHA's marketing team, analyzing data, developing strategies for increasing awareness of CCHA's services and resources. Prior to joining the staff of CCHA in 2023, Daphne was the Museum and Education Director for the Delaware and Lehigh National Heritage Corridor. She has also worked in museum and development roles with the Olana Partnership, the National Trust in the United Kingdom, Science Museum Group also in the UK, and the historic Bethlehem Museum and Sites, and the Western Pennsylvania Conservancy. Daphne received an MA in Cultural Heritage Management from the University of New York. Oh, excuse me, University of York. I can't speak today, in the UK. She also holds an MPIA in International Affairs from the University of Pittsburgh and a BA in International Relations from Mary Baldwin University. So please take it away, Daphne.
All right. Thank you so much, Greg, for that wonderful introduction. Just following up on visual descriptions for anyone who has visual impairments. I am a Caucasian woman with long blonde hair, and I'm sitting in front of a photograph of Bodiam Castle in the UK, which is one of the National Trust properties, which I had the pleasure of working for that great organization. So as Greg mentioned, I am the new Director of Business Development here at the Conservation Center for Art and Historic Artifacts. I started here last October. And prior to that, I was a CCHA client. As the Museum and Education Director for the Delaware and Lehigh National Heritage Corridor, we undertook a preservation needs assessment for our collection. We had some historic maps treated and digitized, and then we also had help with a risk assessment and an emergency plan. So I was very well informed about what the Conservation Center was all about prior to joining as one of the staff here. And I'm a big enthusiast for what we do, especially for small and mid-sized organizations. So as Greg mentioned, one of the key aspects of my new role here is to advise institutions that have collections about various grant opportunities and other funding that can be used, to further your collection care goals. And in particular, for projects that involve our services here at the Conservation Center, we can help you with grant writing as well. I can, help read over your narratives ahead of time. We can come up with various budgets that will work for you. And we also have a contract grant writer as well, who can help with some of the writing aspects of the various grants. So we want to make these opportunities more accessible to you. I know that some of the larger grant programs can seem a little bit scary to those of you who may not have tried to go after them before, but they're really not. So we'll make it a little bit more accessible for you today. All right, so we're going to discuss some of the stages of collection stewardship and where various fundable projects can fall within them. We're going to talk a little bit about the sort of broader scope of grant opportunities that are out there, and some general tips for federal applications in particular. And then we're going to deep dive on the National Endowment for the Humanities and some of its grant programs. We couldn't possibly talk about all of them that they have, but we're going to look at two of them today that are very applicable to collections care. And then finally, we're going to have some time for questions. But as Greg noted earlier, if you don't feel comfortable bringing up your particular organization's projects, you can always make an appointment with me. We can reach out and we can have a virtual meeting. If you're nearby, I can come for a visit. And we can really take a look at what your collection care needs are and what some of the opportunities are. So, as we kind of warned at the beginning, we have a poll question for you. So I wanted to get a little bit of a sense of what your experience is with grants, particularly federal grants. And so we have a quick poll that Camilla is going to bring up. I'm going to give you maybe about 30 seconds to fill that out. All right, maybe Camilla, could we sort of close that up and bring up the results? Okay, so we have a good variety here. So we've got some of you who are sort of grant pros, most of you who are sort of in the middle where you might occasionally apply for a grant, and then there are the grant newbies. So we'll try to gear this towards so that everyone who's involved here today can learn something. But this is very interesting that we've got this variety. Okay, so just to sort of get started, I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the stages of collection stewardship. And we've sort of, this is from my predecessor, actually, Lee Price, who retired earlier this year. And he used this flow chart extensively. And I think it really does, help to further the understanding of how collection stewardship is a process. But this is an ideal flow chart. It doesn't always work exactly this way. But in an ideal world, you would start out with an inventory, so you know what you have in your collection. And knowing what you have is basically the basis for how do you care for it. So the inventory would be your starting place. And then you would move into assessment. And the sort of most basic assessment would be a preservation needs assessment, which takes a look at how you're storing your collection, how you're organizing it, the environment that it's in, what some of the basic risks to your collection are. Then moving along, once you have that sort of basic understanding, what are some of the ways that you can improve the environment for your collections? It's much cheaper and more efficient to care for your collections properly in the beginning than to have to pay for conservation treatment later on, because you had a mold outbreak or there was a leaky pipe that introduced moisture into your environment. So some of the ways, integrated pest management as well, preventing insects from getting a hold on your collection. So some of those preventative measures that you can take to improve the environment for your collections. Then moving along straight down, here you have your more intensive surveys. These are usually looking at particular collections or items within collections, looking at their condition and their individual needs. And that's sort of leading on to what sort of treatment they might require to preserve them for the future, improve their aesthetics, return them a bit more toward what they had been in the past before age and some of the other agents of deterioration got a hold of them. And then as a sort of sidebar from assessment, we have management. So these are your collection policies. These are cataloging, creating finding aids. So that can be happening alongside many of these other processes. And this often leads into digitization. We have a little arrow coming in from treatment as well, because sometimes those can go hand in hand. You have an object treated and then digitized after it's been stabilized and perhaps made clearer and perhaps a little cleaner. Um, and then off to the side there, something that we should always be cognizant of, which is emergency planning. Um, you always want to be ready for the worst. We hope it doesn't happen, but it's something that is very important, and you should always be thinking of no matter what stage you are at in terms of your collection care. And these are just some examples of grant fundable projects that can be associated with some of these stages. So I'm not going to go through all of them, but as I mentioned before, one of the most basic ones is the preservation needs assessment. And that is something typically where a consultant will come in and take an outside view of your collections. They'll do an on-site visit. They'll talk with your staff and your volunteers. They'll take a look at a sampling of your collections, look at any sort of policies that you have, and they'll create recommendations for you with priorities for ways that you can improve your collections care. And this can really form the basis for finding further funding for your collections and moving along into some of the other stages of stewardship. So who are some of the major funders? So the National Endowment for the Humanities, they're the ones we're going to be taking a look at in a little bit greater depth further on. So I'm not going to talk about them too much here, but they're one of the largest funders of humanities projects in the country. The next one on there is the Institute of Museum and Library Services, the IMLS. And they have a variety of grant programs, particularly for collections involving museums. So if you are a museum, and they have some very strict guidelines as to what constitutes being a museum, which you would need to take a look into. They have programs like Museums for America. They have their Inspire grants for smaller museums. And they also have some grant programs that are geared specifically to African American museums and Native American museums. So if you're one of those, you'll definitely want to take a look at them. You'll have much higher success rate applying to those than if you're in the pool of all museums throughout the United States. And they'll fund a variety of collections types of programs. In my last position with the Delaware and Lehigh National Heritage Corridor, for instance, I managed to get a grant for Museums for America to fund a 3-year inventory of our collection storage building. This is one of the cases where I did not follow the flow chart. We had the preservation needs assessment done first, and one of the recommendations was that we needed to have a better intellectual control over the collections that were in our care. And one of the main things was conducting a full inventory of everything that was in our offsite storage building. And so I was able to leverage that preservation needs assessment to get that Museums for America grant. The next one on here is the National Endowment for the Arts. So this is geared more towards sort of the visual arts, music, theatrical performances. So if your organization has an art collection, for instance, this might be a good option for you. So they have a couple of art project grant opportunities for those that are museums or those who have visual art collections. And that you can use those to do a variety of surveys, some treatment and rehousing with those. Next up is the National Historical Publications and Records Commission. This is a division of the National Archives. And these grant programs, they've got a few of them, but they're predominantly involved with digitization and making collections more accessible online. And they also welcome collaborative projects, so multiple organizations working together to make collections more accessible. Next one on here is Save America's Treasures. This is technically run through the National Park Service, but it's a collaboration between them and the NEH and the IMLS. And it overarchingly will fund the preservation of not only collections, but also buildings. And for these, you need a sort of nationally significant collection, and also one that is a little bit imperiled, that has some urgency to the project. So perhaps the collection is deteriorating, for instance, or was subject to a mold issue, something like that. Next one on here is the Council on Library and Information Resources, CLEAR. And they have a wonderful program that is funded by the Mellon Foundation called Digitizing Hidden Collections. And as the name suggests, it is mainly geared towards digitizing projects, particularly those for under-resourced and underserved populations. So ones that have perhaps been ignored in the past. So collections relating to diverse communities, LGBTQ themes, minority communities and such. So that's a wonderful program to look at for those types of collections. And then finally, we have state, county, and municipal sources. Depending on where you're at throughout the country, there are a variety of programs. Some states have some very generous programs. New York State has a great one that has funding up to $40,000. New Jersey as well has an annual program, in Pennsylvania. So it really does depend on where you're at throughout the country. And then finally, private foundations. These tend to be more interested in particular themes. So there are foundations that focus in on American decorative arts, for instance. So you really have to look at what your collection is and your project and try to match those up accordingly. So as I mentioned before, we're taking a deep dive on the National Endowment for the Humanities. And it's an independent federal agency. As I mentioned before, it's one of the largest funders of humanities programs, not just collections. They have a wide variety of different grant programs that fund the creation of humanities content, that support universities and individual scholars. But we're just going to be looking at the collection side today. And one of the reasons why I chose this particular agency to highlight is the wide variety of eligibility for the grant programs. You don't just have to be a museum. You can be sort of really any nonprofit that has a humanities mission and has collections, at least for these particular grant programs. And it's also open to municipal organizations. So if you are, a town museum or archive, or a county related entity, you're still eligible for these. If you are a tribal organization, you're eligible for these. And it's throughout the country, as well as overseas territories. The NEH, as well as the other federal funders, really like to get some geographical diversity in the grants that they give out. So, you know, if you're in Puerto Rico, if you're in the Northern Mariana Islands, you are eligible for these grants. You may even have a little bit of a leg up. Uh, the NEH also, another good reason to choose this one to look at is they'll fund some of the less sexy aspects of collections care. So, you know, those preservation needs assessments, the policies, the rehousing projects. And, you know, not all funders will do that. So what's included in the humanities? This is another great reason to choose the NEH. The wide variety of types of collections that they will fund. So collections relating to language and linguistics, history, that's going to be applicable to many of you. Literature, archaeological collections, comparative religion, anything to do with cultural heritage and traditions is generally fair game. And this last one here, history and criticism of the arts. So there's the NEH, and then there's the National Endowment for the Arts as well. NEA is better for straight art projects, really caring for the artwork itself. NEH will still fund things in the arts, but you have to make that argument for sort of the art history aspect of it. And so that relates to perhaps you have a collection of music. Well, how does that relate to the overall history of music in the United States, for instance? So you can still fit in the arts into NEH grants. You just have to be thinking about how you can make the argument for historical aspect. So the first grant program I really wanted to take a look at is the preservation assistant grants for smaller institutions. These are wonderful. They provide up to $10,000 and there is no match required for this. So it's really great for smaller institutions with small budgets. They only have one cycle per year, and it typically has a deadline in January, and they're anticipating the next deadline to be January 9th of 2025. And then it takes a little while to hear back once you have submitted. So the notification usually comes in August. And then you'll have about 18 months to complete your project. And the types of projects that this will fund are some of those basic ones that we talked a little bit about when we were looking at our collection stewardship stages. So your preservation assessments, your surveys, you can have help with developing plans and policies like emergency plans and risk assessments. You can fund trainings and workshops. So if you wanted, for instance, to have a salvage workshop in case of emergency at your site, perhaps just for your organization or maybe for a consortium of organizations in your area, you can do that with this type of grant. You can purchase housing supplies and shelving. You can also purchase environmental monitoring equipment as well. So a lot of these really kind of unsexy aspects of collections care, but things that are really, really necessary, that are foundational to improving your collections care framework. So I highly encourage you to take a look at their website. I've provided the link here, and I understand that you'll get copies of my slides later on. The wonderful thing about NEH and some of the other federal grantors is they provide a lot of information. They want to be as transparent as possible about the grants and what's required of them. So they have some really great resources on their website. And then sort of the next step up from that are the Humanities Collections and Reference Resources grants. So there are two levels to these grants. There's a planning grant size, and that is up to 50,000. And then there's an implementation size, which is up to 350,000. And once again, there is no match required, so that these are really accessible for organizations. Um, Once again, there's only one cycle per year, and they just opened these up earlier this week. The next deadline is going to be July 16th of this year, and then the notification will be next April. And in terms of how long you have to complete the project, you have 2 years for planning, 3 years for implementation. And these grants are designed to make collections more accessible. So the types of things that they are funding are cataloging, organizing, creating finding aids, digitizing collections in particular, and creating online databases that can be searched by scholars and the general public. And once again, I have the link here. I encourage you to look at it. The most recent cycle of these was just announced on April 16th. So you can take a look at what some of those other projects were that were just funded and see if there's any inspiration there. Just give you an example. One project that we're involved with here at the Conservation Center is assisting the Historical Society, the Huguenot Historical Society of New Paltz, and they were just awarded a grant that was just shy of the 350,000 mark for implementation. And so they're undertaking conservation, digitization, and rehousing of about 2,500 historical records from the 17th and 18th, or no, 18th and 19th centuries from the colonial Hudson Valley area. And we're going to be assisting them with the treatment and the digitization aspects of that. So I do encourage you to take a look at what's on the website and learn a little bit more. So one of your first steps in thinking about applying for a federal grant is that you need to be registered with both SAM.gov and grants.gov. And this can be one of the more tedious steps in this whole process. Fortunately, it is all free. So if you do see somewhere out there that there's a service that will do this for a fee, you do not need to use those. You can do them straight through these websites that the government provides, and you do not have to pay anything to do this. And I encourage you, if you're thinking about applying for federal grants and you are not registered with these two sites yet, do it early. It can take, in good times, it can take a few weeks. In bad times, if there's other things going on in the government, it can take longer. And the last thing you want is to be sweating, wanting to submit your grant and not having these things come through. So first step is going to sam.gov. You will be prompted to create a login with login.gov. Which you will then be able to use in a variety of different governmental sites. You will be assigned a unique entity ID and a cage code, and these are just ways that the government identifies your organization versus others out there. They used to use a DUNS number, but that has been usurped by this unique entity ID. You're going to want to have your basic organizational data handy to fill out the questionnaires, things like when your organization was incorporated, and various other your fiscal years and such. You want to have all of that information easy to hand so you can fill it out, but you can always come back and do it later. So you can go in and look and see what's required and then come back and fill it out. And then you want to make sure that you're designating somebody as the main point of contact. And this is sort of essentially your administrator for your account. And that's going to be the person who, when you get to grants.gov, is going to be able to give other people in your organization roles and rights to submit grants. So once you have sam.gov all taken care of, you've got your unique entity ID, you will go over to grants.gov. Once again, it is entirely free. You want to be the person who is that main point of contact. You're going to want to create that account first using that login.gov login and your unique entity ID. And once you have created your profile for your organization, then you can invite others from your organization to have roles in grants.gov and enable them. You can work collaboratively on your grants together. Sort of some general tips, and these are not just for NEH grants, but essentially for most federal grant applications. You want to really take a look at the guidelines very carefully. The federal government will issue what's known as a Notice of Funding Opportunity, a NOFO, and it outlines exactly what they want in what format. So they will tell you what font size to use, what fonts are accessible, how to break up your narrative, all of the required aspects, all of the required attachments that you'll need to provide. So it's a little bit of an intimidating document usually. They're usually kind of well over 50 pages with all of the various requirements the federal government has, but they tell you exactly what they want. So do take a look at those, read them over carefully, make sure that you're eligible, and see what you need to provide. Also, on particularly the NEH website, but as well as the IMLS, they're providing sample grant narratives from past awarded grants right there on their website. So take a look at those, see if there's a project that is similar to the one that you're thinking of pursuing, and have a read and get some inspiration, see how they organized their information. These were grants that were awarded, so they did something right. So take a look at those. Learn and use the language of the funder. For instance, NEH. Now, we call the sort of most basic assessment for collections a preservation needs assessment, but the NEH calls them a general preservation assessment. So use their language. And they list out some various priorities, goals for their agency in the beginning of that notice of funding opportunity. So try to parallel some of their language and adapt your project to what some of their overarching goals are. And follow their format to a T if you can. They'll tell you once again what font size to use, what the acceptable margins are, what the sections need to be. So do follow that. They even tell you what your file names should be in most cases for the various attachments. And don't be afraid to contact the program officer. They are there to help you. They're being paid by our taxes, and they want you to succeed. So if you have a question, you just want to sort of pitch an idea as, is this something that they might be interested in? Feel free to reach out to them, set up a virtual meeting, have a chat with them. I've always found them to be very, very friendly. Some of the grant programs offer you the ability to submit a draft before the final deadline. If they do, and you have the opportunity to do that, you should take advantage. It's great to get the feedback from the program officer about your grant application, and they can, highlight any sort of red flags and make suggestions. So if that's if that is something that is eligible for that particular grant, do take advantage of it. And then last but not least, don't wait until the last minute. I will fully admit I have been there at 11:45 p.m., right at the grant deadline where, it's closing at 11:59. I've been there, I admit it, but it's a lot less stressful if you're not. And I also have been there when grants.gov has crashed. And that particularly happened when NEH and IMLS offered some COVID era grants, and there were lots and lots and lots of applicants, and a fairly short window to submit. And it did crash, and that was highly stressful. And so I would suggest if you can manage it, don't wait till the very last minute. Key sections of NEH proposals. So the meat of your application is going to be your narrative. And once again, NEH is going to tell you pretty much what they want to see in that narrative. And you'll probably have to be talking a little bit about your organization's humanities credentials. You're going to have to talk about the significance of your project, why it's important. Going to have to talk a little bit about how you're going to evaluate your program as well. So they'll really lay out for you what some of the questions are that you need to answer in your narrative. But you also want to make it as engaging as possible. People are reading these applications, not a machine. Thankfully, we're not at the point yet where AI is making the decisions on who gets funded. This is going to be read by a variety of people. I'll talk a little bit more about the review process. So you do want to make it interesting. You don't want to assume anybody knows anything about your project or the history involved. And just give them as much information as you can within the format that they give you. Some of the grant programs, you're limited to sort of 5 pages in a narrative. Some are 10 to 15 pages. So it depends on which one you're applying for. The next two are also very, very important. The work plan is how you schedule out the work that is going to happen. And sometimes I actually start here when I'm putting together a grant application and try to get everything sort of straight in my head as to what has to happen in what order for this to be successful. And you want to make sure that your narrative reflects what is in your work plan. And then your budget, the budget form itself is usually a very, very federal thing. It can be a little bit intimidating for those who aren't accustomed to it, but it's fairly straightforward. But the meat is in that budget justification. And this is a sort of a Word document where you go through how you came to the various numbers that you have inputted into your budget. If you're asking for 10% of this person's salary, this is how it was calculated. So both very important parts of your proposal. And then you're going to be listing out who's going to be doing the work, the various personnel, whether they're your own staff or if they're outside consultants or scholars. And you're going to be providing resumes for those people as well. And then in most cases, you're going to be having either letters of support from organizations who are helping to, or individuals, I should say, to attest to the importance of your project. So why is this particular collection relevant and significant? And letters of commitment, and those are from formal partners to your project. So if you're using a consultant, if you're working with the Conservation Center, or if you're collaborating with another organization, you will need a letter of commitment showing that that partner is committed to your project. And then additional supporting information. So, Attach photos. People love photos. If you already have a preservation needs assessment and you're building off of that, attach that. So, really think about what you can use to support your application. And further on, making your project stand out. So um, this is a national funder, so we want to try to make a case for national significance. And sometimes you need to think a little bit outside the box to do this. If you have a collection that maybe is sort of really significant to your particular region, maybe you need to think about the sort of larger context. Maybe your collection is representative of the experience of German immigrants to the United States. It may be dealing just with your particular area, but you can try to make that case for the broader significance. So you want to try to do that as much as you can. You also want to right size your request for the project and for your organization. So, just because you can ask for 350,000 in that implementation for the HCRR grants, if you're a fairly small organization, the reviewers are going to look at that and say, is this too big of a grant for this particular organization? Is this more than they can handle? So just because you can ask for that full amount, that may not be the best option for you. You should really make sure that your organization can handle the grant if it is awarded. So just because you can, um, make sure that you're asking for the right amount. And don't overcommit yourself. It doesn't make a lot of sense to suggest that your curator is going to spend 100% of their time on this project. They have other commitments, to your organization. So they're not going to be able to spend that full amount of time, even if you'd love to cover 100% of their salary as part of the grant. It's not realistic, and the reviewers will note that. Try to involve outside experts and humanities scholars. NEH loves humanities scholars. So any way that you can pull in an expert in the field, they love that. So it can be as little as a quote in your application from a professor at a university, stating, how important your collection is and the resource potential that the research potential that is there. Or it could be literally collaborating with a scholar to develop a new resource. So if you can, try to involve others and tell a story. Once again, the people reviewing these applications are people, and they have to read a lot of these applications. And if you can make yours if you can really give them a sense of your collection and provide examples and really tell a story about why your collection is important, that will make this really stand out. And if you can, impart a sense of urgency. Why is now the right time for this application? Is there an upcoming exhibition? Are you getting ready for the 250th celebration in 2026? Is there a threat to this collection? If you can, give it that sense of urgency. And then demonstrate your commitment to collections care. So this is where, if you can show that you have had a preservation needs assessment done, and now you're moving on to, maybe one of the recommendations was to improve the environmental monitoring and storage of your collection. So you're asking for archival boxes and temperature and humidity gauges, and you can reference back to that recommendation in the preservation needs assessment. That is going to go a long way. All right, so you've come up with your application, you've hit the submit button. Now what? So it can take a little while for NEH applications to be reviewed because they are very thorough. First, the staff go through and make sure that you're eligible for the grant and that the grant itself is complete. Um, then they pass it along to peer reviewers. These are teams of folks just like you, actually, and you yourself can be an NEH reviewer. They're all volunteers, and they go through and they score the applications. Then it goes back to the program officers. They'll take the sort of best of the bunch and make recommendations to the National Council on the Humanities, who meet a couple of times per year. And then the council reviews the applications and advises the NEH chair, and he or she is ultimately the one that makes the decisions. So if you're one of the lucky few who is awarded a grant, congratulations. The next step will be that your program officer will contact you probably by email, and they'll invite you to create an eGMS account to manage your grant online. And that makes everything really smooth. That's how you contact your program officer. It's how you submit reports and how you request funds to be released. And make sure to acknowledge the NEH whenever you can, and alert your local legislators about the impact of the grant, because pretty much every year the NEH's budget comes up for review, and we want to make sure that the legislators really know how important this grant program really is. If you're not successful, please try again. You're going to be supplied with some great feedback from the peer reviewers, and you can use that to strengthen your project and reapply. So try and try again. So now I thought I would open it up to you guys to see if you have any questions. Once again, if you don't feel comfortable in this format, but you want to have a chat and brainstorm about grant opportunities, you can always reach out to me directly. Best way is usually by email, and I'd be happy to have a chat with you one-on-one. So, Greg, do you want to see if there's any questions popping up?
Yeah, thank you for that presentation, Daphne. I thought that was so clear and there were so many great tips there. Just waiting for questions right now. Please, if you have any for Daphne, let us know. I will say, and Daphne, you were very egalitarian about this, but a lot of the services that you mentioned that you can use those grants for, we can often provide, like the preservation needs assistant grant, that salvage workshop that Daphne mentioned. So we're here to help with that too, of course. But obviously, this isn't an endorsement. We're just one of the many services that you can choose for some of these services once you do get that NEH grant. So yeah, so if there are any questions, we'll take them now. Okay, so we have a question. Monica Montgomery asked, does CCHA offer collection storage for an independent collection as service? So we don't have storage in our facility. There are other vendors in Philadelphia, for example, that do that. I believe, don't quote me on this, but I'm pretty sure Atelier is one in Philly that does that. But yes, we don't actively do that, I'm afraid.
No, I will say though that it's something that we have played around with a little bit, because we know it's a need, especially for smaller organizations who don't have facilities that can provide the proper climate control for storing collections. We know it's an issue out there, and we're thinking about what some of those potential solutions might look like. So stay tuned. I don't know, certainly not in the short term, but we're thinking, long term, what are some of the ways that we can improve storage options for particularly smaller organizations.
Other questions? I'm seeing a nice comment from Libby. Thank you for that. Anything else that is on people's minds? Anything you're curious about? I see someone has raised their hand. If you do have a question, you can just put it in the chat. That might have just been a little, I often do that. I accidentally click that little button. No worries if you did. um, but yeah, I think that if there are no more questions, we can let you go a little early. Thank you so much for coming. Let's see. Oh, do you have a dollar amount available in terms of like maybe the maximum that you can apply for with some of these grants that Daphne mentioned? Is that the question?
Yeah, so the preservation assistance grants max out at 10,000. That could change when they um, reissue the guidelines. It'll be probably in October that they issue the guidelines for the 2025 round of preservation assistance grants. So it's possible it might be increased a little bit. They do take into account inflation. Um, but that's where that one stands at the moment. And the next round of the HCRR grants are definite at this point. It's 50,000 for that planning level and up to 350,000 for the implementation. But they can be smaller than that. I wouldn't apply for a $10,000 grant for HCRR. That probably that would be sort of too far on the low end for those grant programs, uh, but yeah, you can definitely sort of scale it up.
I think there's a clarification,
Oh,
total budget for the NEH, maybe in terms of like how many grants are available.
well, I can talk a little bit about that. So, yeah, for instance, the preservation assistance grants, they have some really nice statistics on their website. So over the last 3 years, they received about 141 applications per year for that grant program. And they gave out 68 awards. So about just under half of the folks who applied for preservation assistance grants got them. The HCRRs are a little bit more selective. Over the past 5 years, they receive about 195 applications per year, and they only give out 35 awards. And that's only about 18% success rate in terms of those. But it can depend. They are given their budget every year by Congress. So it depends, how much they're allocated to how much they can give out per year. Um, and so it's always good to, if you're ever having a conversation with any of your legislators at the federal level, to really impart how important these types of grant programs are.
Nice. Any other burning questions out there that we can answer before we wrap up at 1 here? Well, and if not, that's totally fine. I wanted to say just a big thanks to Daphne for such a wonderful presentation and for answering those questions. Thank you to Camilla Dawson, who's been working behind the scenes with all of the tech and setup for today's webinar. Again, we wanted to thank the National Endowment for Humanities, the William Penn Foundation, and the Independence Foundation, and to all of you for showing up today. So you'll see on the screen our next webinar is going to be Legal Issues in Collections Care, Abandoned Property Law on May 16th at noon. And if you're in the Philly area and you want to meet us in person, please come by on April 24th, anytime between 5 and 7:30 for our open house. We hope to see you at either or both of those programs if possible. Um, and just a reminder, so when this program ends and the window closes, you're going to get a little survey that pops up. Please fill that out and let us know how we did. That'll also be sent in that email just in case you missed it. And we'll send those resources out. So thanks again, everybody, and hope you have a lovely rest of your Friday.
Yes, thanks so much.
Bye.